a teenage film snob, baby. I was a teenage film snob, baby.
The year is 2003. The X-Men have been crushing it at the box office, but now we need a new hero, a darker hero, one that wears leather in the rain, throws villains in front of trains, and listens to Evanescence. We don't want a guy with powers. We want a normal guy. A blind guy. A blind guy who can see in the rain and do backflips and catch moving objects and dodge bullets. Maybe he isn't such a normal guy after all. Welcome to Ours Teenage Film Snob. I'm James Chalmers, and this is why you should watch Daredevil. Guys, we're back at it. We're doing another Why You Should Watch, talking about a film that I love, that people maybe haven't given enough attention to, maybe been a little bit harsh on. So we're going to check out Daredevil from 2003. I will preface this by saying, like most fans, I prefer the director's cut. So we are going to talk about the film and its history in general, but ultimately at the end of this episode, my stance won't have changed. Watch the director's cut. That's the true version. That's what the director wanted you to see. It has about half an hour of extra footage and definitely is worth your time. But because a lot of people don't know about the director's cut, the general audience, it just kind of gets lumped in as like a bad comic book movie from the early 2000s, which isn't true at all. It suffered from its studio interference and people not knowing about the director's cut. So, with that in mind, let's talk about some stats. We'll talk about some history. We'll talk about why people don't like it, and then I'll tell you why you should watch it. So the film was directed by Mark Steven Johnson, who would go on to direct Ghost Rider and When in Rome. It was also written by Mark Steven Johnson, who previously wrote Grumpy Old Men, Jack Frost. He would go on to write Ghost Rider, and Christopher Robin. So you can see already there's not a bad resume on the guy. Do you know what I mean? Like, it definitely wasn't the director's fault or the writer's fault in this situation. He had quite the caliber under his belt. The studio was 20th Century Fox. This is still long before Disney acquires 20th Century Fox. The film was made on a budget of $78 million and had a return box office of $179 million. So it just about broke even if you use Hollywood maths, which of course they need to make double what they paid for them to be happy. So they definitely made enough to warrant a sequel. They didn't do a sequel. They instead did a spin-off film, Elektra, which we might talk about one day, although I'm not a huge fan of that film, so we might not. Huge fan of the character, not so much the movie. The cast of Daredevil is Ben Affleck, Jennifer Garner, Colin Farrell, Michael Clarke Duncan, Jon Favreau, Ellen Pompeo, and Joe Pantoliano. The film has an IMDb score of 5.3 out of 10, and on Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 42% critic score and a 35% audience score. And this is what I'm talking about. It's not often the audience likes something less than the critics. Critics are always going to be harsher on movies. The audience score should be higher, and I truly believe it's because the audience, most of them, is not aware of this director's cut. But before we talk about that, before we talk about why we like it and why you should watch it, let's go back in time. Let's look at the history. In 1997, 20th Century Fox decided they wanted to make a Daredevil movie with their newly acquired rights. You might not be aware of this, but Marvel almost went bankrupt in the 90s. So in order to keep the company afloat, Stan Lee started selling off properties left and right to keep the company going. And that's why we have this insane division of characters over multiple film studios. There wasn't one studio who wanted everything. Sony got Spider-Man, Fox got the X-Men and Daredevil and Fantastic Four. Disney got a handful of things. So all over the place. He did what he needed to save the company, and it was the right move. It would mean a lot of trouble over the cinematic landscape later on, trying to get those characters together. But we now have studios playing nicely. We have Spider-Man showing up in the MCU. We've got the Fox characters back. But that's why. So if you didn't know why that was happening, this is exactly why. However, due to poor planning, the rights lapsed and almost went back to Disney. In 1999, negotiations fell through, however, and Fox managed to retain the rights and once again decided to make a Daredevil movie. This took a long time. From 2000 to 2001, the project went through a minor development hell, but eventually Mark Steven Johnson was hired to write and direct the movie. His name was attached, I believe, as early as the late 90s, but with all the rights issues, Daredevil was just one of those films that took so long. And I think the problem was Daredevil was not a character that people knew. If you're a comic book fan, you would know Daredevil. I didn't know who Daredevil was until this movie came out. When this movie came out, I was still fairly new to comic book movies. I hadn't picked up a comic book at all. And I thought Daredevil was just made up by a filmmaker. I didn't know that it was a comic book. I was like, oh, they created a new hero. But of course, the success of X-Men definitely pushed that forward with Fox. In 2001, Mark Steven Johnson met with director Kevin Smith on a movie set in LA. He knew that Kevin Smith was an avid comic book fan and asked him who should be cast as Matt Murdock Daredevil, to which Kevin Smith recommended Ben Affleck, having worked with him a number of times and citing that he could play any role, even the shark in Jaws. There's a really great story online, or if you have access to An Evening with Kevin Smith, he tells the story of this, and it's pretty entertaining. Months go by, and Affleck signs on to play the titular role, causing some friction with Smith and the development of Jersey Girl, but that's a story for another time. A cast of stars pads out the rest of the film. We get Jennifer Garner as Elektra, Colin Farrell as Bullseye, Michael Clark Duncan as Kingpin, Jon Favreau as Foggy Nelson, Ellen Pompeo as Karen Page, and Joe Pantoliano as Ben Urich. The stage was set for a much darker take on the Marvel Universe. The X-Men films have some darkness in them for sure, but there's definitely a lot more hope and light in them. Spider-Man, again, there's some tragedy, but mostly very positive. With Daredevil, they wanted to do a more mature take, a more grown-up take. And this would cause problems through development and filming and release, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the cast of the film is incredible. What a great cast. And now I love the casting of the TV series. If you've watched the Netflix series or Born Again on Disney+, the casting is so strong. But for an early 2000s Daredevil film, I think the casting, they nailed it. I think it's one of the best cast films they've had. There's some interesting choices. Colin Farrell being an Irish Bullseye, I think rubs some people the wrong way, but I think he embraces the insanity of the character. Michael Clark Duncan, I think was a choice that people, I never heard any pushback on it, but I'm sure it would have surprised some people just given the nature of the character. But Michael Clark Duncan had such a presence on screen. He was such a big guy. I don't think there's a human being alive that more embodied the physicality of the role. Even D'Onofrio, who's fantastic and terrifying. I think if you stood them next to each other, Michael Clark Duncan would have dwarfed him. So really great casting. And Ellen Pompeo, this is a pre-Grey's Anatomy Ellen Pompeo. She would go on to Grey's Anatomy not much later, and then the rest is history there. So Johnson submits his cut, which is significantly longer than the theatrical release. The studio mandated that 30 minutes needed to be cut from the final version so they could get more screenings in the theaters, and they want to change the dark, vengeful tone of the film into a more gothic love story. Enter the playground sequence, one which I'll talk about in a moment, and definitely one that I've said time and time again I can't defend. Johnson makes the cuts. He removes large chunks of the story from Elektra, Bullseye, and Kingpin to satisfy the studio needs, and the film is ultimately met with mixed reviews. Mark Steven Johnson went on record saying that he tried to do too much in the film. He wanted to do a Daredevil origin story, but also do Bullseye and Elektra and Kingpin, which makes sense. They're Daredevil's three biggest villains. They're the ones that people are probably most likely to know. And he wanted to really get some bang for his buck. So he cited that, the decision wasn't the right one. But getting 30 minutes cut out certainly didn't help. There's so much plot taken out from the director's cut to satisfy that studio need. Another example of this is Batman vs. Superman. If you've ever watched that film, if you only ever saw it in theaters, you haven't seen the true vision. And again, half an hour was cut out. And it's just, it's night and day. They're completely different movies. Now, a director's cut would be released later on home video, which is much truer to what Johnson had wanted to release and is the preferred cut of most fans. So if you haven't seen the director's cut, go and check it out. It's wonderful. I watch it once every couple of years easily. I've watched it this year and I watched it last year. I really, really enjoy it. It does feel like a product of its time for sure. It has a real 2000s edge. But even still, it's a classic for me. Let's dissect the complaints about Daredevil 2003. So the first complaint was the jarring tone and the music, which I understand. The tone is a little bit contradictory, and that comes from the studio changes as well. If you watch the director's cut, it's a lot darker. It's a lot more consistent. There's still that love story. Elektra and Matt Murdock is one of the great love stories. I know it's a very toxic relationship, but I'm a big fan of it, particularly the way they do it in the Netflix series. If you look at the season finale of season 2, There's this wonderful sequence on the roof between Matt Murdock and Elektra about Matt willing to give up being Daredevil and throw it all away so they can go on the run and love each other, and it's beautiful. And then the hand kills Elektra. Spoiler alert. So I love their relationship, even though it's complicated and a little bit toxic. And in the comics, there's all sorts of great stuff. Recently, in the last 10 years, Matt Murdock went to prison, and Elektra stepped in and took over as Daredevil, becoming less of a villain and more of a kind of, not even quite an anti-hero, just a hero with less rules. I guess more like Punisher, perhaps. But the tone of this is all over the place. There's light humor, especially after Matt Murdock gets out of the hospital. So as a boy, he's recovering. He's learning to embrace his blindness and his powers. And there's a lot of kind of slapsticky jokes and stuff like that, where he beats up 3 guys in an alleyway and he stops Stanley from getting hit by a truck. And then, we cut to grown-up Matt Murdock, and he's very tortured and agonized and depressed, and it's a very dark, moody piece. But then there's also the playground sequence, which we'll talk about. There's a whole section on that one. As far as the music, I get that as well. The music, the score is wonderful. It's Graham Revell, who also scored Sin City. He does wonderful work on movie scores. But there was a big push in the 2000s to create these kind of almost like jukebox soundtracks where you can set an entire tone by the music you're choosing, and it's very dated. Like if you look at the Spider-Man soundtrack, there's Hero by Chad Kroeger, and I think it's Josie Wells. And it's a great song, but it's very much a product of the early 2000s. You can't not think of the early 2000s when you hear it. And it's the same with this soundtrack. There are like 3 Evanescence songs on this soundtrack. And again, going into that whole gothic romance feel, I think that's what they were aiming for. Like, the kids are into Evanescence, so therefore they'll be into this movie. But it is quite unusual. And there's a whole sequence where Elektra is training with sandbags dropping out of her roof from nowhere, and she's fighting it while listening to Bring Me to Life, it's just a weird choice. And again, it feels like a studio note. The next complaint was clumsy CGI. I'm okay with the CGI. I know what they're talking about. So there's a number of sequences where Matt Murdock is swinging through buildings at night. He doesn't have webs like Spider-Man. He uses his billy club. So the billy club, which is practical, by the way, the billy club is one of the coolest things in the movie. It's a blind man's cane during the day, but then when he twists it, it turns into his billy clubs, and he can use it to fight people. There's a string between them, so he can use it to kind of rappel through buildings and stuff like that. But the buildings are all CGI. The storms are a bit CGI. And when he uses his rain sight to see Elektra, that's CGI as well. It does come off a bit cartoony, but you have to remember it is 2003. I would compare it to, if you've ever watched the Flash TV show, whenever they show the Flash running through the city or chasing a villain up and down buildings, it does get a little bit computer, like video game graphic. It's fine. It doesn't bother me. Yes, I understand the CGI looks a bit clumsy, but for its time and for what they're trying to achieve, and the use of light and shadows really hides a lot of the mistakes there. So I think it's okay. Too many subplots. This is only because of the theatrical cut. If you watch the director's cut, there's a lot more of everything. It doesn't, you can't paint, 4 fully formed origin stories in a 2-hour film, but it does a really good job of letting you know who these characters are, what they stand for, what their motives are. So the director's cut does fix the subplots. Over-the-top supporting characters, and they're talking about particularly Bullseye. A lot of people didn't like Colin Farrell's portrayal of the character. I quite like it. It's very different from Wilson Blethel's performance in the Netflix series. Wilson Blethel is manic, is insane, but there's also a real quiet calm to him. So it's almost like he's constantly trying to keep the insanity at bay. Whereas in this, it's similar to Uma Thurman as Poison Ivy. It's very big, it's very grandiose. There's catchphrases, there's jokes, there's grunting and a lot of eye work. But I like it. It wouldn't work in the Netflix series. It wouldn't work in the current MCU. But for this film, it feels very much at place. I just think people were a bit surprised by it and caught off guard. Another example would be Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor. I know a lot of people don't like that performance. I really like it because it's bold and different. And you know how I feel about big swings. And then the final complaint is the playground scene. And this is, of the 5 complaints, the one I can fully get behind. I understand all of the complaints. I don't agree with them. This one I do. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, the first time Matt Murdock meets Elektra is in a coffee shop. Matt Murdock is having a meeting with Foggy. They're talking about an upcoming case. Elektra walks through the door of the cafe, and Matt Murdock can smell her because his senses are heightened. He introduces himself, and then he decides he wants to get her name, so he kind of chases her down the street. And she, rightfully so, is like, hey, stop chasing me, I don't know you. And they end up having a fight. So you can, I guess, see their kind of like ability, I guess. You can see their different techniques. But it's done on a playground, and it's very flirty. And it's on like seesaws, and children are cheering and stuff. It's very strange. It doesn't quite make sense. I do believe it's from a comic book, which just goes to show some things work on the page a lot better than they do on the screen. It just feels so out of place. It just doesn't make sense in relation to the rest of the movie. I don't like it. I don't like it. And it's very rare for you to hear me say that about anything in film. I don't like the playground scene. I get it. If they were going to cut anything from the film, that's what they should have cut. But I guarantee you the studio was like, you need to keep that in, we're building a romance here. Okay. We've talked about its history. We've talked about its stats. We've talked about the things people don't like. So let's talk about why you should watch it. First of all, it honors the source material very, very well. A lot of the comic book movies took liberties. They will make changes here and there. We talked about costumes and stuff like that before. Whilst I don't like the use of leather, this is a post-Matrix movie. Everything after the Matrix, they had leather. If you look at the X-Men film, they're all wearing leather. Whilst I don't like the costumes, the actual look of the characters is really cool. The look of the film is cool, the tone of the film, and yeah, it really honors the comics quite well. Like, Matt Murdock feels like Matt Murdock. Daredevil feels like Daredevil. Kingpin feels like Kingpin. Bullseye feels like Bullseye. Elektra feels like it's very, very close to the source material. Closer than most others, I think. I'm also going to give them points for the attempt to make a more mature film. Yes, it is restricted by some of the changes made, but you do have Daredevil throwing people in front of trains. You've got him lighting gasoline on fire to make the Daredevil symbol. There's that whole scene at Josie's bar where he's attacking Joe Quesada. There's a bad guy called Joe Quesada who was the president of or CEO of Marvel Comics at the time. It's a funny little Easter egg. Ben Urich, yeah, the tone, it just all works for me. It works so, so well. Everything about Daredevil and his accessories, the Billy Club, I think, is one of the coolest things they've got in there. If I go back and look at all the different weapons over the last 20 years in superhero films, I think the Billy Club is still one of the most unique ones. And they did a really good job bringing it into Born Again. It was a little bit underutilized in the Netflix series because they're trying to keep it so grounded. But in Born Again, the first scene, Daredevil literally swings up using his Billy Club. And then when he's fighting Muse, he uses his Billy Club to rappel across a room to punch him quicker. So I love all that. So the Billy Club is very, very cool. It wasn't afraid to take risks. Characters die in this film. We have the death of Elektra. We have not the death. I can't remember if Bullseye dies. He gets thrown out a window, but I don't think he dies. We have the death of Elektra's father. We have the death of Jack Murdock. We get some origin stuff there as well. Wesley, we haven't talked about Wesley, played by Leland Dowser, I think it was. Wesley is so good in this film. Wesley is Kingpin's right-hand man, and we get him in the first season of Netflix, but he's killed by Karen Page. But both performances, both actors, I think, perform Wesley so, so well. So I think even though there's a lot of complaints about the film, I think the characters are great. I think the tone is great. I think the Billy Club is great. I think the score is great. And I think it just honors the comics so well. I really, really enjoy it. I think it's incredibly underrated. I think the fight scenes, except for that playground scene, are really good, especially Daredevil fighting Kingpin at the end. Daredevil fighting Bullseye in the church, climbing up the organ. Like, that's a really cool sequence. There's so many great set pieces in it. It's just covered in cheese. If you take the cheese away, it's great. But that's Daredevil. those are my thoughts. I really dig it. I think it's incredibly underrated. Watch the director's cut. I cannot say this enough. The director's cut is so worth your time. It's really exciting. Got some really great performances in it, some really great set pieces. And I think it holds up quite well if you keep in mind it's a product of 2003. So that is it. We have more comic book movies coming up. I've got some Fantastic Four films to talk about. I've got Howard the Duck to talk about and plenty others as well. But until then, thanks for listening, and that is why you should watch Daredevil. But watch the director's cut. I'll see you next week.